Hey guys, tonight we begin with blood-soaked sand beneath your feet, the deafening roar of 50,000 Romans screaming for your death, and the very real possibility that you'll never see another sunrise. We're talking about what it actually meant to be a gladiator in ancient Rome, and trust me, everything you think you know from Hollywood is absolutely wrong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You wake up in what can only be described as a prison cell, because that's exactly what it is. The Gladiator Barracks, or Ludus, as the Romans called it, isn't some noble training academy from your favourite movie. It's a cramped, windowless room you share with 3 other men, sleeping on straw mattresses that haven't been changed in months. The straw has turned black in places from sweat, blood, and things you don't want to think about. Your pillow is a bundle of rags that smells like every person who used it before you died on it. The air is thick with a smell of unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, and the lingering metallic scent of blood that never quite washes out of the stone walls. There's also the constant smell of human waste, because the latrine is just a hole in the ground in the corner, shared by everyone in your block. Privacy is a concept that no longer exists in your vocabulary. Your day starts before dawn with the sound of chains rattling and guards shouting in Latin. The chains aren't decorative, nem real, heavy iron shackles that have worn permanent grooves in your ankles. The metal is cold in winter, burning hot in summer, and always, always heavy. Every step you take reminds you that you're property, not a person. Because despite what the movies show you, most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. You're literally property with a price tag. That romantic notion of noble volunteers seeking glory and honor. Maybe 1 in 20 gladiators chose this life, and they were probably either desperate beyond belief, fleeing debts that would have gotten them killed anyway, or completely insane. The rest of you, you're here because someone conquered your homeland. You stole bread to feed your family, or you worshipped the wrong god at the wrong time. The first thing you do each morning is check your body for new injuries, and there are always new injuries. That gash on your shoulder from last week's training session is infected. You can tell by the angry red streaks spreading toward your armpit and the yellow pus that leaks out when you move wrong. The wound smells like rotting meat, because that's essentially what it is. There's no real medical care here, just a ludus doctor who's basically a butcher with delusions of competence. This so-called doctor thinks prayer and wine cure everything. If you're incredibly lucky, he might stitch you up with thread that's been used on 3 other men before you, after wiping it on his already bloody tunic. Infection isn't a possibility, it's a guarantee. Most gladiators die from infected wounds long before they ever set foot in the Colosseum. The lucky ones die quickly from blood poisoning. The unlucky ones linger for weeks, slowly rotting from the inside out while still being expected to train. Your left knee hasn't bent properly since that mace blow 3 months ago. Every morning it's stiff and swollen, and you have to work through the pain just to walk. There's a constant ache in your lower back from sleeping on stone floors when you're being punished, which happens whenever you show the slightest sign of defiance or even depression. Breakfast is a bowl of barley gruel that tastes like wet cardboard mixed with disappointment and has the consistency of wallpaper paste. Sometimes there's a bit of stale bread if you're fortunate enough to be in the trainer's good graces that week. The water tastes like it came from the same trough they use for the animals because, well, it probably did. You've learnt not to think too hard about the small chunks floating in it. You're fed just enough to keep you alive, and strong enough to fight, nothing more. Forget about enjoying food. That's a luxury from your past life that seems like a dream now. You dream about your mother's cooking, about fresh fruit, about meat that doesn't taste like it died of natural causes weeks ago. Your body craves nutrients it never receives, leaving you perpetually exhausted and irritable. The other gladiators eat in silence, partly because talking during meals is forbidden, but mostly because there's nothing left to say. You've all accepted that you're probably going to die soon, and making friends just makes it harder when you're forced to kill them or watch them die. After breakfast comes training, and this is where Hollywood really got it spectacularly wrong. You're not learning elegant sword techniques or practicing dramatic speeches about honor and glory. You're learning to die entertainingly. The lanista, your trainer and owner, doesn't actually care if you win or lose your fights. He cares about putting on a good show, because that's what brings in money from the crowd and keeps the sponsors happy. A gladiator who dies spectacularly, who screams at the right moments and bleeds dramatically, can actually be worth more to the ludus than one who wins boringly. The lanista would rather have a fighter who loses in an exciting way than one who wins quickly and quietly. Death sells tickets. Victory is just a bonus. The weapons you train with are deliberately cumbersome and poorly balanced. Your practice sword might be blunted, but it's also twice the weight of a real weapon and awkwardly distributed. The idea is to build your strength while simultaneously making sure you can't actually kill your trainers or use the weapons to escape. Even a blunted sword can do serious damage if you're desperate enough, so they make sure you're too exhausted from lifting the things to try anything clever. The wooden training posts you hack at for hours each day are stained dark with the blood of countless gladiators who came before you. The wood is soft from years of abuse, and embedded in the splinters are fragments of skin, fingernails, and sometimes teeth from men who trained too hard or were beaten for poor performance. Every time you strike the post, you're literally hitting the remains of dead men. Your hands are permanently damaged from gripping weapons that don't fit properly. The blisters have become calluses, which have cracked and bled and become new calluses. Your fingers are swollen and stiff, and you can't fully straighten them anymore. Fine motor control is becoming a memory, which is terrifying because your life depends on your ability to manipulate weapons with precision. Your fellow gladiators aren't your friends. They can't be. They're your competition, your future opponents, and potentially your executioners. That guy Marcus you've been training with for 6 months, sharing jokes and complaints. Next week you might face him in the arena, and only one of you will walk out alive. The psychological torture of this situation is incredible and deliberate. You form bonds with these men because human beings need connection to survive. But you also know that showing mercy in the arena could mean your own death. So you're constantly torn between your need for companionship and your instinct for survival. Some gladiators handle this by becoming completely cold and distant. Others break down mentally and become useless for fighting. A few manage to maintain their humanity somehow, though they usually don't last long. The worst part is when you're forced to fight someone you actually care about. The trainers do this deliberately because the crowd loves the drama of watching friends kill each other. They'll announce that it's a friendship fight, and the audience goes wild. They bet on which friend will break first, which one will show mercy, which one will deliver the killing blow when the time comes. Let's talk about the different types of gladiators, because yes, you're categorized and trained like livestock for specific types of slaughter. The Romans had dozens of different gladiator classes, each with their own weapons, armor, and fighting styles. Your assignment isn't based on your preferences or natural abilities. It's based on what the trainers think will create the most entertaining deaths. Maybe you're a retiarius inept fighter. This sounds exciting and unique until you realize you're nearly naked, wearing only a loincloth, and a small armed guard, trying to catch heavily armored opponents with a fishing net while they hack at you with real swords. Your life depends entirely on your ability to dance backwards while throwing a net, which is exactly as ridiculous and terrifying as it sounds. The net itself is your primary weapon, but it's also incredibly unwieldy. If you miss your throw, and you probably will, because you're nervous and your opponent is actively trying to kill you, you have to retrieve the net while avoiding sword strikes. If your net gets tangled or damaged, you're essentially defenseless against an armored opponent with a sharp weapon. Your backup weapon is a trident, which sounds impressive until you realize it's mainly useful for keeping people at a distance, not for actual killing. The Retiarius fighting style is deliberately designed to be disadvantageous. You're fast and mobile, but you have no real protection. One good hit from your opponent, and you're done. The crowd loves Retiarius fights because they're unpredictable and often end quickly when the net fighter makes a mistake. Or perhaps you're a murmler, which means you get a big rectangular shield and a gladius sword, but also a helmet so heavy you can barely turn your head. The helmet weighs about 15 pounds and sits awkwardly on your shoulders. After wearing it for more than a few minutes, your neck starts to ache. After an hour of fighting, you can barely lift your head. The eye holes in the helmet are tiny slits that restrict your vision to about 30 degrees directly in front of you. Imagine trying to fight for your life while looking through a mail slot. You can't see attacks coming from the sides, you can't judge distances properly, and you definitely can't see the reactions of the crowd or read the mood of the sponsors. The Murmillo helmet is deliberately designed to make the fight more challenging and entertaining for the spectators. They want to see you stumbling around, half blind, swinging your sword at empty air while your opponent dances around you. The more confused and desperate you look, the more the crowd cheers. Your shield is large and strong, but it's also incredibly heavy. After holding it up for more than a few minutes, your arm starts to shake from fatigue. The shield is your primary defense, but it's also an anchor that slows you down and exhausts you. By the end of a long fight, you can barely lift it, leaving you completely vulnerable. Then there are the Thracians, who fight with small shields and curved swords. The Thracian fighting style is fast and aggressive, but the small shield offers minimal protection. You're basically trading defense for speed, which works great until you make a single mistake and take a sword to the chest. The Secutor class is specifically designed to hunt Retiari. You're heavily armored but slow, and your job is to chase down the net fighters and hack them to pieces once you catch them. The irony is that being a Secutor means you're expected to win most of your fights, which sounds good until you realize that winning gladiators are kept alive to fight again and again until they eventually lose. Some gladiators fight from chariots, others fight with exotic weapons from conquered territories, and a few are forced to fight as women or dressed as women for the crowd's amusement. Every variation is designed to create a specific type of entertainment, and none of them are designed with your survival as the primary goal. The worst assignment might be the Noxi Imesa criminals, condemned to die in the arena without weapons or armor. These aren't really gladiator fights. They're public executions disguised as entertainment. Noxi are often fed to wild animals or forced to kill each other with crude weapons until only one remains, who is then executed anyway. Training for your specific gladiator type takes months or even years, during which you're constantly reminded that you're learning skills that will probably get you killed. The trainers don't sugarcoat this reality. They tell you exactly how previous gladiators in your category died, what mistakes to avoid, and what fighting techniques tend to result in quick deaths versus slow, entertaining ones. The psychological preparation is perhaps worse than the physical training. You're taught to accept death, to embrace it even. The trainers explain that death in the arena can be glorious if you do it right, that dying well is better than living as a coward. They're essentially programming you to cooperate in your own execution. Between fights, you might sit in your cell for weeks or months, knowing that each passing day brings you closer to your probable death. The waiting is its own form of torture. Boredom mixed with terror creates a special kind of psychological hell that breaks many gladiators before they ever enter the arena. You develop superstitions and rituals to cope with the constant threat of death. Maybe you always eat your bread in a specific order, or you say a prayer to whatever gods still listen to the prayers of the damned. These rituals don't actually protect you, but they give you the illusion of control in a situation where you have absolutely none. Some gladiators become obsessed with keeping track of time, scratching marks on the walls to count days, or trying to remember what season it is. Others deliberately lose track of time, because knowing how long you've been trapped just makes everything worse. The smart ones learn to live entirely in the present moment, because thinking about the future or the past leads to madness. When a fight day is announced, the entire ludus changes. The guards become more alert, the trainers more intense, and the gladiators more quiet. Everyone knows that some of the men currently sharing jokes and complaints won't be alive tomorrow. The night before a fight, nobody sleeps well. You're herded like cattle through underground tunnels beneath the Colosseum on fight day. These tunnels are a maze of stone corridors, holding cells and mechanical lifts that bring gladiators, animals, and stage props up to the arena floor. The sound above you is tremendous. 50,000 people stomping their feet, screaming, betting on your life, and generally having the time of their lives at what will probably be your funeral. You can hear the crowd through solid stone, and it sounds like the ocean during a hurricane. The noise is so constant and overwhelming that it becomes a physical pressure in your ears. Your hands are shaking uncontrollably. Your mouth is completely dry, and you're trying desperately not to vomit from pure terror. Some gladiators do vomit, and the guards just laugh and make jokes about feeding the scared ones to the lions. The smell in the tunnels is indescribable. It's a mixture of human fear sweat, animal waste from the exotic creatures kept in cages, old blood that's soaked into the stone over decades, and the acrid smoke from torches and braziers. The air is thick and hard to breathe, which doesn't help your already racing heart. Other gladiators pace in their holding cells, like caged animals, which is essentially what you all are. Some pray to their gods, others sharpen their weapons obsessively, and a few just sit in silence staring at nothing. The veterans, the ones who have survived multiple fights, often try to sleep, though whether this is confidence or resignation is hard to tell. The mechanical lifts that bring you up to arena level are marvels of Roman engineering, but they're also terrifying. You're locked in a cage that's suddenly lifted by counterweights and pulleys, emerging through trapdoors in the arena floor, like some kind of monster being summoned from the underworld. The crowd goes wild when gladiators appear this way, because it's dramatic and unexpected. When you finally emerge into the arena, the first thing that hits you isn't the crowd noise, it's the heat and the smell. The sun reflects off the white marble seating and hits you like a physical blow. Rome is hot in the summer, and the Colosseum is like a giant stone oven. You're already sweating before you take your first step, and dehydration will become a serious problem if the fight lasts more than a few minutes. The smell is hot sand mixed with blood, both fresh from today's earlier fights and old blood that's been absorbed into the arena floor over the years. There's also the smell of urine from terrified gladiators and wild animals, the metallic tang of fierce sweat from 50,000 spectators, and the various foods and drinks being consumed in the stands. Expensive incense burning in the imperial box doesn't quite cover the fundamental smell of death that permeates everything. The sand beneath your feet isn't just sand, it's deliberately mixed with sawdust to absorb blood more effectively. By the end of a typical day of games, This mixture has turned into a crimson slurry that sticks to your sandals and stains your legs up to the knees. You're literally walking through the liquefied remains of everyone who died before you today. The arena floor is also littered with pieces of broken weapons, torn armor, and sometimes body parts from earlier fights. The cleanup between events is minimal because the crowd actually enjoys seeing the evidence of previous carnage. Stepping on a severed finger or slipping on a piece of someone's intestines is just part of the Gladiator experience. The crowd itself is a living entity that seems to have its own heartbeat and breathing pattern. 50,000 people moving and shouting in unison creates air currents and sound waves that you can feel in your chest. When they all cheer at once, the sound is so loud it's actually painful. When they all go silent to watch a particularly dramatic moment, the quiet is somehow even more terrifying than the noise. The spectators aren't there to cheer for you, they're there to be entertained by your death. That's the fundamental reality that gladiator movies always get wrong. Romans didn't come to see great athletes compete in honorable combat. They came to watch human beings die in creative and dramatic ways. The bloodier and more spectacular your death, the better the entertainment value. If you die quickly and quietly, the crowd boos and demands their money back. If you scream and writhe and beg for mercy while bleeding dramatically, they cheer louder and throw coins into the arena. Your agony is literally their pleasure. Understanding this psychological dynamic is essential to grasping just how dehumanizing the gladiator experience really was. The betting that goes on during fights is intense and complicated. People aren't just betting on who will win, they're betting on how long the fight will last, what type of wound will end it, whether the loser will beg for mercy, and dozens of other gruesome details. Your death is a gambling opportunity for people who will go home to comfortable homes and loving families after watching you bleed out in the sand. Your opponent enters the arena from the opposite side, and you get your first good look at the person you're supposed to kill or be killed by. This is when the reality of your situation really hits home. It's not a training exercise anymore. It's not practice. This other human being is going to do everything in their power to end your life in the next few minutes, and you're expected to do the same to them. Maybe your opponent is someone you know from your own ludus, or maybe they're a complete stranger from a different gladiator school. Either way, you can see the same fear in their eyes that you feel in your own chest. Neither of you wants to be here. Neither of you chose this. But here you are anyway, about to fight to the death for the entertainment of people who see you both as less than human. The fight begins with a trumpet blast that sounds like the voice of death itself. Within seconds, you understand that everything you trained for is essentially meaningless when you're actually trying to kill someone who's trying to kill you. Real combat is pure chaos, nothing like the controlled exercises you practiced. You slip in the blood-soaked sand almost immediately and fall hard on your back. The impact knocks the wind out of you, and your opponent's sword comes down toward your face. You roll away just in time to feel the blade scrape along your ribs, opening a gash from your armpit to your hip. The pain is immediate and overwhelming, but you can't stop to acknowledge it because he's already swinging again. Blood is streaming down your side and pooling in the sand beneath you. Every movement sends fresh waves of agony through your body, but stopping to deal with the pain means certain death. Your vision starts to go red at the edges, partly from rage and desperation, partly from blood loss. The crowd noise becomes a constant roar that drowns out your ability to think clearly. Everything becomes pure instinct and animal desperation. You're no longer a person with thoughts and feelings. You're a wounded animal trying to survive. Your training kicks in, not as conscious technique, but as muscle memory that operates below the level of rational thought. Slash, block, dodge, strike, these actions happen without your mind being involved. Maybe you get lucky and manage to wound your opponent. His blood joins yours in the sand, and suddenly you're both slipping and sliding, trying to kill each other while struggling to stay upright on the increasingly slick surface. It's not graceful or heroic, it's ugly and desperate and absolutely terrifying. The sand gets into your wounds, causing infections that will probably kill you even if you survive the fight. Every grain feels like broken glass grinding against exposed flesh. Your wounds are also attracting flies, which sounds like a minor annoyance until you're trying to fight for your life while insects are literally trying to lay eggs in your open cuts. If you're losing mind statistically, you probably are, since gladiator fights were often rigged to ensure specific outcomes. You have a choice to make. You can continue fighting until you're literally chopped to pieces, or you can raise your finger to signal surrender and throw yourself on the mercy of the crowd and whoever is sponsoring the games. Surrender doesn't mean safety or even survival. It means you're now completely at the mercy of people who came here specifically to watch you die. The decision about whether you live or die is made by spectators who don't know your name, don't care about your family, and see you as nothing more than a temporary diversion from their daily lives. The crowd votes on your fate, and their decision is based entirely on how entertaining your performance was. If you fought well and provided good drama, they might vote to let you live. If you were boring, cowardly, or disappointing, they'll vote for your death. It's not about justice or mercy, it's about customer satisfaction. The famous thumbs up, thumbs down vote is actually more complicated than movies suggest. The crowd uses various hand signals to indicate their preferences, and the final decision often rests with the sponsor of the games or the emperor, if he's present. Sometimes they'll spare a gladiator just to demonstrate their own magnanimity, regardless of what the crowd wants. If you receive the death sentence, you're expected to die with dignity according to Roman standards. No screaming, no begging, no trying to run away. You kneel in the sand, expose your throat, and wait for your opponent to deliver the killing blow. The sand around you is already soaked with your blood, and you can taste copper in your mouth from internal bleeding. Your opponent approaches with their weapon raised, and you're supposed to meet death bravely. Some gladiators manage this final act of defiance. Others break down completely and have to be held in position while they're executed. A few try to run or fight back, which usually results in being hacked to pieces by multiple fighters while the crowd jeers. The actual moment of death varies depending on the weapon and the skill of your executioner. A good gladiator can kill you quickly with a single thrust to the heart or throat. A less skilled or more sadistic opponent might take their time, inflicting multiple wounds before delivering the final blow. The crowd prefers the dramatic option, so there's social pressure to make deaths last longer than necessary. But let's say you survive this particular fight. Congratulations, your reward is getting to do it all again next week, or next month, or whenever the game's schedule demands fresh blood and entertainment. Each time you survive, the odds of dying in the next fight actually increase, not decrease. It's basic mathematics, combined with the inevitable deterioration of your body and mind. The human body can only absorb so much damage before systems start failing permanently. That infected shoulder wound from your first fight never properly healed, so now you have limited mobility in your sword arm. The concussion from your second fight left you with persistent headaches and occasional double vision. The leg injury from your third fight means you can't pivot quickly anymore. All of these accumulated injuries make you slower, weaker, and less effective in each subsequent fight. Meanwhile, you're being matched against fresh opponents who haven't fought recently and haven't accumulated your collection of old wounds. The system is deliberately designed to ensure that even successful gladiators eventually lose and die. The psychological damage accumulates even faster than the physical injuries. You've now killed other human beings with your own hands watched friends die horribly, and lived through experiences that would traumatize anyone. Sleep becomes increasingly difficult as nightmares replay your fights and the faces of people you've killed. Some gladiators develop what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, though Romans had no understanding of mental health issues. Even if you become famous, Cold and some gladiators did achieve a kind of celebrity status. You're still fundamentally a slave. You still sleep in a cell, still eat terrible food, still face death regularly for other people's entertainment. Fame might get you slightly better weapons, basic medical care, or marginally improved living conditions, but it doesn't buy you freedom or humanity. Famous gladiators were often used for special exhibitions or private parties where wealthy Romans could get close to these dangerous celebrities. You might be forced to fight at a nobleman's dinner party, while guests eat and drink and place bets on your performance. Being a celebrity gladiator often meant more fights, not fewer, because your name could sell tickets. The most successful gladiators, the ones who survived dozens of fights over multiple years, weren't necessarily the most skilled fighters. They were the ones who best understood that they were performers first and warriors second. They learned to make their victories look dramatic, their defeats appear heroic, and even their deaths seem spectacular. These veteran gladiators became actors in an elaborate theatre of death. They knew how to work the crowd, how to make a fight last the right amount of time, how to create dramatic moments that would have spectators talking for weeks. It was a survival skill that had nothing to do with combat ability and everything to do with understanding entertainment psychology. Your family, if you had one before becoming a gladiator, probably considers you already dead. Gladiators existed in a social netherworld, not quite human, not quite animal. Even if you somehow managed to earn your freedom through years of successful fighting, you'd be marked for life as someone who killed for entertainment. Former gladiators were banned from holding public office, marrying into respectable families, serving in the military, or participating in most aspects of normal Roman society. The stigma was permanent and extended to your children, and sometimes even your grandchildren. Freedom from the arena didn't mean freedom to live a normal life. The few gladiators who did earn their freedom often found themselves with no useful skills for civilian life. Killing people with swords isn't exactly a transferable job skill in peacetime. Many ex-gladiators ended up working as bodyguards, trainers at gladiator schools, or in other violent professions because it was all they knew how to do. Some freed gladiators actually chose to return to fighting because they couldn't adjust to civilian life. The constant threat of death, the adrenaline of combat, and even the cheers of the crowd became addictive. They literally couldn't function without the structure and purpose that the arena provided, even though that structure was designed to kill them. The psychological damage of gladiator life went beyond what happened in the arena. You were trained to kill people you'd grown to care about, forced to perform your own potential death for the entertainment of people who saw you as subhuman, and conditioned to live in constant fear while maintaining the appearance of bravery. This kind of psychological manipulation would break most people completely. Many gladiators went insane in ways that Romans recognized and documented. Some became catatonic and had to be force-fed and dragged to fights. Others developed what seemed like multiple personalities, becoming completely different people when they put on their armor. A few became so violent and unpredictable that they had to be kept in isolation between fights. Depression was common among gladiators, though Romans didn't have a medical understanding of mental illness. Gladiators who became too depressed to fight effectively were usually killed rather than treated, since they were no longer useful for entertainment purposes. Suicide was technically an option, though it was considered cowardly and usually resulted in punishment for your friends and fellow fighters. Some gladiators tried to escape, though the punishments for attempted escape were designed to be worse than death in the arena. Crucifixion was a popular choice for runaway gladiators, and it was deliberately done slowly and publicly to discourage others from trying. The few escape attempts that succeeded usually ended with the escapees being hunted down and killed in even more brutal ways. The famous Gladiator revolt, led by Spartacus, wasn't really about seeking freedom in any positive sense. It was about the fact that life as a gladiator had become so unbearable that certain death fighting the Roman army seemed preferable to continued existence in the ludus. Think about that for a moment. Organized suicide was literally better than the life of a gladiator. Spartacus and his followers knew they couldn't actually defeat Rome or establish a free territory where ex-gladiators could live normal lives. They fought because dying as free men in battle was more appealing than continuing to die as slaves in the arena. Their revolt was essentially a mass suicide with extra steps, chosen because it offered a chance to die with some dignity. Even the good owners of gladiator schools treated their fighters like valuable livestock rather than human beings. You might be fed better than a common slave. You might receive basic medical care to keep you fighting longer, but you were still property to be bought, sold, or disposed of however your owner chose. The training regimen was deliberately designed to break you mentally as much as build you physically. Sleep deprivation, constant fear, inadequate nutrition, social isolation, and regular beatings weren't accidental byproducts of gladiator training. They were intentional techniques designed to create men who would perform their own deaths without rebellion or resistance. The Romans had studied what it took to make human beings kill each other for entertainment, and they developed systematic methods for psychological manipulation that were remarkably sophisticated. Modern military and intelligence agencies would recognize many of the techniques used in gladiator schools as forms of brainwashing and conditioning. Here's perhaps the cruelest irony of gladiator life. Many fighters were forced to participate in multiple events during a single day of games. You might kill a man in the morning, barely survive the encounter yourself, receive crude medical attention, consisting mainly of wine and prayers, and then be forced back into the arena in the afternoon against a fresh opponent who hadn't fought yet. The crowd loved these marathon fighting days because they got to see the same gladiators progressively weaken, accumulate injuries, and eventually succumb to fatigue and blood loss. It was like watching a slow-motion execution that lasted all day, with multiple opportunities for dramatic reversals and unexpected deaths. Some gladiator games lasted for weeks, with the same fighters appearing day after day until they were all dead or too injured to continue. The audience could follow ongoing storylines, develop favourites, and watch long-term character arcs that always ended in death. It was serialized entertainment where every episode ended with someone dying. The economic reality of gladiator schools made long-term survival almost impossible for individual fighters. Training a gladiator represented a significant investment, but maintaining one over multiple years was expensive and risky. From a purely business perspective, it made more sense to use gladiators intensively for a short period and then replace them rather than try to keep them alive indefinitely. Gladiator school owners calculated the optimal number of fights per gladiator to maximize return on investment. Too few fights and you didn't recoup training costs. Too many fights and you had to spend money on medical care and extended housing. The sweet spot was usually somewhere between 5 and 15 fights per gladiator, spread over 6 months to 2 years. This economic calculation meant that even if you were an exceptionally skilled fighter, your owner had financial incentives to ensure you didn't live too long. Success in the arena was ultimately self-defeating because it made you more expensive to maintain while not proportionally increasing your value as entertainment. So the next time you see a movie about gladiators, that portrays them as noble warriors fighting for honor and glory. Remember the reality: you were a victim in an elaborate, state-sponsored murder program designed to entertain a civilization that had grown so wealthy and bored that watching people die had become their favorite pastime. You weren't a hero, you were a human sacrifice offered to the gods of Roman entertainment, and your death was always the point of the entire exercise. You're crouched in the dim light of a single candle, and your knees are already protesting against the hard wooden floor. It's barely dawn, but you've been up for 20 minutes already, because Mrs. Henderson's boots need to be perfect before she descends for breakfast. And if they're not, well, you've learned that lesson the hard way. The candle flame flickers as you work, casting dancing shadows across the worn leather that's seen better decades. Your fingers are already sticky with a mixture of soot, melted wax, and whatever mysterious substance has accumulated on these boots since yesterday. You're holding what used to be a perfectly good candle, one that cost more than you'll see in wages for the next 2 days, and you're about to sacrifice it to make someone else's footwear gleam. The irony isn't lost on you, but irony doesn't pay for food. The technique sounds simple enough when the head butler explained it with that condescending tone that suggested you should have been born knowing these things. Heat the candle until it's soft but not dripping. Work it into the leather with circular motions, then buff it out with a cloth until it shines. What he didn't mention was that getting the temperature just right requires the kind of precision that would make a clockmaker weep. Too cold, and you're essentially trying to rub a rock against leather. Too hot, and you've got molten wax everywhere, including places you didn't know wax could reach. You hold the candle closer to the flame, watching the bottom edge begin to soften. The smell hits you immediately. That particular aroma of melting tallow that somehow manages to be both comforting and nauseating at the same time. It's the scent of cow fat rendered down and mixed with whatever questionable ingredients the chandler thought would make it burn longer. Your stomach growls, reminding you that breakfast is still hours away, and you try not to think about how this candle probably cost more than the meal you'll eventually eat. The economics of this situation are frankly absurd. Here you are, earning perhaps 8 shillings a week, if you're lucky, using a candle that costs 3p to shine boots that cost more than you'll make in a year. The mathematics of servitude are always depressing, but they're particularly stark when you're literally burning money to make someone else look respectable. The candle maker, wherever he is probably sleeping soundly in his bed right now, blissfully unaware that his handiwork is being sacrificed to the gods of footwear maintenance. The wax is ready now, soft enough to work with, but not quite liquid. You press it against the leather, and immediately your fingers are coated in a warm, greasy mess that will take scrubbing with lye soap to remove, assuming you can find time to scrub them before the next task. The wax spreads unevenly, leaving streaks and patches that look more like a child's art project than professional boot care. The texture is fascinating in the way that unpleasant things often are. It's simultaneously slippery and sticky, coating your fingertips with a layer of grease that seems to have its own agenda. You try to wipe some of it off on your apron, but that just spreads it around, creating new patterns of stickiness that will follow you through the rest of your morning tasks. By the time you're done, you'll be able to track your movements through the house by the faint, greasy fingerprints you leave on everything you touch. You work it in with your thumb, feeling the leather absorb the grease with all the enthusiasm of a sponge that's given up on life. The boot is old, my 'tis, really old, and the leather has developed that particular flexibility that comes from years of being bent, twisted, and exposed to every form of weather London can produce. Which is to say, it's about as pliable as jerky that's been left in the sun for a week. The leather tells a story if you know how to read it. There's a scuff near the toe that speaks of hurried steps on rough cobblestones, probably during that rainstorm last week, when Mrs. Henderson insisted on walking to the milliner's shop, despite the weather. The heel shows uneven wear that suggests she has a slight favouring of her left foot, something you've noticed but would never dare mention. There are tiny scratches that could only have come from the sharp stones that litter the paths through Hyde Park, evidence of morning walks taken in defiance of the season. The circular motions the butler described are easier said than done when you're working with a surface that has more character than a Dickens novel. Every scratch, every scuff, every place where the leather has been worn thin by years of walking on cobblestones becomes a trap for the wax. You find yourself working it into crevices that seem designed by some malevolent deity specifically to make your life more difficult. Your back is starting to ache from hunching over, and you realize you've been holding your breath without knowing it. The candle flame is getting dangerously close to your hair, which you should have tied back properly, but there wasn't time, and now you're caught between the risk of setting yourself on fire and the certainty of disappointing Mrs. Henderson, who has made it clear that disappointment is not tolerated in her household. The morning routine is always the same, and yet never quite the same. Mrs. Henderson rises at precisely 7 o'clock, takes her morning tea at 7:15, and expects to find her boots waiting by her dressing room door at 7:30. This gives you exactly 10 minutes to transform yesterday's weathered footwear into something that meets her exacting standards. 10 minutes to work a minor miracle with nothing but candle grease, determination, and the kind of desperate energy that comes from knowing your job depends on the quality of your work. The other servants think you're mad for volunteering for this particular duty. Mary, who handles the breakfast service, thinks you're asking for trouble. She's got eyes like a hawk, Mary warned you on your first day. She'll spot a speck of dust from across the room and make you feel like you've personally insulted her ancestors. But Mary doesn't understand the appeal of working alone, in the quiet hours before the house wakes up, with nothing but your thoughts and the satisfaction of a job well done. The first boot is finally ready for buffing, and you reach for the cloth, a piece of soft cotton that was once part of a shirt that was once white. Now it's the colour of everything else in this house that's been used for cleaning, a sort of universal brown that speaks to the fundamental reality of 19th century life. Everything, given enough time, turns brown. The cloth itself has its own history. It was part of a shirt that belonged to Mr. Henderson's younger brother, who died of consumption 3 years ago. Rather than throw it away, the household staff claimed it piece by piece for various cleaning duties. There's something poetic about using fabric that once covered a gentleman's chest to polish his sister-in-law's boots, though you suspect the poetry would be lost on both the dead brother and the living sister-in-law. Buffing is supposed to be the satisfying part, where all your hard work pays off and the boot transforms from shabby to spectacular. In reality, it's an exercise in patience that would test a saint. You rub the cloth in small circles, applying just enough pressure to work the wax into the leather without removing it entirely. Too little pressure and nothing happens. Too much, and you've just undone everything you've accomplished. The technique requires a kind of intuitive feel that takes weeks to develop. You have to read the leather like a book, understanding where it needs more pressure, where it needs less, where the grain runs smooth, and where it rebels against your efforts. Some patches of the boot seem to actively resist your attempts at improvement, clinging to their shabbiness like a badge of honor. The leather slowly begins to respond, developing a sheen that catches the candlelight. It's actually working, which is both gratifying and slightly surprising. The boot is starting to look like something a respectable person might wear, rather than something they'd throw at a cat. You can see your reflection in the toe, distorted and wavering, but unmistakably there. But here's the thing about boots shining with candle grease that nobody mentions. It's not just about making the boots look good. It's about waterproofing, about protecting the leather from the kind of weather that turns London streets into rivers of mud and worse things. The grease soaks into the leather, creating a barrier that will keep Mrs. Henderson's feet dry when she ventures out into the world that seems determined to soak everything and everyone in it. London in November is particularly brutal to leather goods. The fog carries more than just moisture. It's loaded with soot from thousands of chimneys, salt from the Thames, and chemical residues from the factories that ring the city. Without proper protection, even the finest leather will crack and split within months. Your early morning labours are literally extending the life of these boots, though you doubt Mrs. Henderson thinks of it that way, when she examines your work with that critical eye that seems to catalogue every imperfection. You move on to the second boot, and immediately realise that the first one was apparently the easy one. This boot has character, and by character, you mean it's been through some kind of adventure that involve things you don't want to think about too closely. There are stains that seem to have achieved a sort of permanence, as if they've signed a lease and plan to stay for the duration. The stains tell their own story, and it's not a pleasant one. There's something dark and crusty near the ankle that could be mud, or could be something worse that you encounter when walking through the less fashionable parts of London. There's a splash pattern across the instep that suggests contact with something liquid and unsavoury. The heel bears the unmistakable marks of having been scraped against cobblestones, probably in an attempt to remove something that had no business being on a lady's footwear. This is where the real skill comes in. Anyone can make a clean boot shiny, but transforming a boot that's seen the reality of London street life into something presentable, that's an art form. You attack the stains methodically, working the grease into each one, coaxing the leather back to something resembling respectability. The candle is getting shorter, and you're acutely aware that you're literally burning money. Each minute the flame consumes is money that could have bought bread, or coal, or any of the 100 things that would make your life marginally less miserable. But the boots must be perfect, because Mrs. Henderson has the kind of observational skills that would make a detective weep with envy, and she will notice if the left boot is even slightly less lustrous than the right. The mathematics of candle consumption are depressingly precise. A standard tallow candle burns at approximately 1 inch per hour, and this particular candle started at 8 inches. You've been working for almost 2 hours now, which means you've consumed roughly 2 inches of candle, worth approximately a penny. A penny doesn't sound like much until you realise it represents nearly an hour of your wages, and that's assuming you can find work every day, which is far from guaranteed. As you work the grease into the problematic leather, you find yourself thinking about the cow that provided the tallow for this candle. Somewhere, a cow lived its life, ate grass, mooed at inappropriate times, and eventually became, among other things, the substance you're now rubbing into someone else's footwear. There's a poetry to it, in a grotesque sort of way. The cow probably lived on a farm somewhere outside London, where the air was cleaner and the grass was actually green, instead of the sooty grey that passes for vegetation in the city. It spent its days doing cow things, chewing, standing around, occasionally providing milk for someone's breakfast. And now here it is, transformed into light and heat and boot polish, serving purposes that would have been incomprehensible to its original owner. The transformation from living creature to household necessity is one of those everyday miracles that nobody thinks about. The chandler who rendered the fat into tallow, the merchant who sold the finished candles, the butler who requisitioned them for household use, they're all part of a chain that connects your early morning labours to a pastoral existence that might as well be on another planet. The grease is warming up from the friction of your rubbing, and the smell is becoming more pronounced. It's not entirely unpleasant. There's something almost wholesome about it, like the smell of cooking but without the promise of food at the end. Your stomach growls again, more insistently this time, and you realize you've been working for over an hour and haven't had so much as a cup of tea. The hunger is becoming a distraction. It's not the sharp, immediate hunger that comes from missing a meal, but the deeper, more persistent hunger that comes from never quite getting enough to eat. Your breakfast will be porridge if you're lucky, or bread and tea if the household budget is tight. Either way, it will be consumed quickly, standing in the kitchen while you review the day's tasks with the other servants. The second boot is finally beginning to cooperate, developing the same reluctant shine as the first. You buff it with renewed vigor, partly because you can see the finish line, and partly because movement helps ward off the cold that's seeping through the thin walls of this servant's room. The fire in the main house won't be lit for another hour, and the heat from your small candle is barely enough to keep your fingers from going completely numb. The cold is a constant companion during these early morning sessions. The servants' quarters are located in the basement, where the walls are stone and the windows are small and set high in the walls. Even in summer, there's a chill that never quite goes away. In November, it's like working inside a tomb. Your breath comes out in small puffs that dissipate quickly in the still air. The cold affects everything. Your fingers become clumsy, making it harder to manipulate the cloth with precision. The wax becomes more stubborn, requiring more heat to soften it properly. Even the leather seems to resist your efforts more when it's cold, as if it's trying to conserve whatever warmth it can muster. You hold both boots up to the light, examining them with the critical eye of someone whose breakfast depends on perfection. They're not perfect. Perfect would require better materials, better lighting, and probably a different century. But they're good enough that Mrs. Henderson might actually nod approvingly, instead of finding 17 different ways to express her disappointment. The boots gleam in the candlelight, the leather smooth and protected, ready to face whatever horrors the London streets might throw at them. You've transformed something worn and weathered into something that wouldn't look out of place in a respectable drawing room. It's a small victory, but in a life where small victories are the only kind available, you take what you can get. The transformation is genuinely impressive. What started as tired, stained leather now has the kind of lustrous finish that speaks of care and attention to detail. The grease has not only improved the appearance, but also created a protective barrier that will help the boots survive another day of London's assault on anything that dares to be clean or attractive. You clean your hands as best you can with a damp rag, though the grease has worked its way into every crease and under every fingernail. The smell will linger for hours, a constant reminder of your early morning labour. But the boots are done, and done well, and that's what matters. The hand cleaning process is an art form in itself. The grease doesn't come off easily with just water. It requires a combination of soap, scrubbing, and patience. Even then, there will be traces under your nails and in the creases of your fingers that will remain until they wear away naturally. It's a badge of your profession, though not one you wear with particular pride. The soap is harsh stuff, made with lye and ash, and it leaves your hands red and raw, but it's necessary if you want to avoid transferring grease to everything you touch throughout the day. The other servants would notice, and more importantly, Mrs. Henderson would notice, and that's a conversation you'd prefer to avoid. As you place them carefully by Mrs. Henderson's door, you can't help but feel a tiny spark of pride. In a world that seems designed to make you feel small and insignificant, you've taken something ordinary and made it extraordinary. You've mastered an art that requires skill, patience, and a willingness to sacrifice expensive candles for the sake of someone else's appearance. The placement of the boots is crucial. They must be positioned exactly parallel to each other, toes pointing toward the wall, heels aligned with the edge of the Persian rug that runs along the hallway. Mrs. Henderson has very specific ideas about how things should be arranged, and deviation from her preferences is not tolerated. The boots sit there in the dim hallway light, perfect and gleaming, waiting for their moment of judgment. In a few hours, Mrs. Henderson will emerge from her room, examine them with the thoroughness of a military inspector, and either nod approvingly or find fault with some aspect of your work. The approval is silent and brief. The criticism is detailed and lengthy. The candle has burned down to almost nothing, and you pinch out the flame carefully, saving the last stub for tomorrow morning's ritual. In 6 hours you'll be back here, with another candle and another pair of boots, ready to begin the process all over again. But for now, you've done your job, and done it well, and in the grand scheme of things, that's no small accomplishment. The stub of candle will be carefully preserved, added to the collection of stubs and odds and ends that accumulate in the servants' quarters. Nothing is wasted in a household where money is scarce, and every penny counts. The stub will be melted down and combined with others to create new candles, continuing the cycle of illumination and boot polishing that defines your early morning routine. The ritual will repeat tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the boots wear out, or you find other employment, or the world changes in some fundamental way that makes boot polishing with candle grease obsolete. But for now, in this moment, you've achieved something close to perfection in a world that rarely offers such satisfaction. As you make your way back to your quarters, you can hear the first stirrings of life in the main house. The cook is beginning her preparations for breakfast, the scullery maid is stoking the fires, and somewhere above, Mrs. Henderson is beginning her morning routine. Your work is done, invisible and essential, one small part of the elaborate machinery that keeps a proper Victorian household functioning, and tomorrow you'll do it all again. You're 7 years old, and you've just been told that you won't be seeing your sister Margaret for quite some time, perhaps years. The adults are discussing this as if it's perfectly reasonable, the way they might discuss the weather or the price of grain, and you're standing there trying to understand why the person you've shared a bed with every night, for as long as you can remember, is suddenly being loaded into a carriage bound for your aunt's estate 3 counties away. The reasoning, as explained by your father, with the patient tone reserved for children who ask too many questions, is quite simple. Margaret is 8, which means she's reached the age where she needs to learn proper feminine accomplishments. Your Aunt Catherine has agreed to take her in and oversee her education in embroidery, music, French, and the delicate art of managing a household without actually appearing to do any work. You, being a boy, will remain here to begin your education in Latin, mathematics, and the fundamentals of estate management. What nobody bothers to explain is why this education can't happen under the same roof, why Margaret's need to learn the harpsichord requires her complete removal from your daily existence. The adults speak of it as if it's obvious, natural, the way things have always been done. Your mother nods approvingly as she packs Margaret's belongings into a trunk that seems impossibly large for someone so small. The concept of childhood, as we understand it, doesn't really exist yet in 1750. You're not children being separated from each other. You're small adults being prepared for your distinct and separate roles in society. Margaret will become a lady, skilled in the arts, that will make her attractive to a suitable husband and capable of running his household efficiently. You will become a gentleman, educated in the skills necessary to manage property, conduct business, and maintain the family's social position. The carriage that arrives to collect Margaret is impressive in the way that expensive things often are, even when they're fundamentally uncomfortable. It's owned by your aunt's husband, a man of sufficient prosperity to maintain his own conveyance, complete with a driver who tips his hat respectfully to your parents, and looks at you and Margaret as if you're parcels to be delivered, rather than people with opinions about the arrangement. Margaret handles the departure with the kind of composure that adults always praise in children, though you can see the uncertainty in her eyes. She's been told this is an honour, an opportunity, a chance to receive the finest education available to a girl of her station. She's also 8 years old and has never spent a night away from home, never been more than a day's walk from the village where she was born. The preparations for her departure have been going on for weeks, though the adults have been remarkably successful at keeping the details from both of you until the last possible moment. There have been whispered conversations that stop when you enter the room, letters exchanged with your aunt, and a great deal of discussion about wardrobes and necessities that seemed abstract until this morning, when they became heartbreakingly concrete. Your mother has packed Margaret's belongings with the thoroughness of someone who knows it will be months before any forgotten items can be retrieved. There are dresses for different occasions, undergarments that have been carefully mended and pressed, a small collection of books deemed appropriate for a young lady's education, and a doll that Margaret has had since she was 3 and has never slept without. The doll is perhaps the most heartbreaking item in the trunk. It's a simple thing made of cloth and stuffed with straw, with button eyes and yarn hair, that has been combed and recombed by Margaret's careful fingers. It has no monetary value, no educational purpose, no practical function, except to provide comfort to a little girl who is about to be transplanted into an entirely unfamiliar world. Your Aunt Catherine is known to be a formidable woman, though you've only met her twice in your life. She married well into a family with more money than landed nobility, and she has definite opinions about how children should be raised. Her own daughters were sent away for their education and returned as accomplished young ladies who spoke fluent French, played the harpsichord beautifully, and could manage a household staff with quiet efficiency. The assumption is that Margaret will receive the same transformation, that she'll return in a few years as a polished young woman ready to take her place in proper society. What nobody discusses is the cost of this transformation, the way it requires the complete severing of family bonds during the most formative years of a child's life. The educational philosophy of the era holds that children are essentially raw material to be shaped by proper instruction and discipline. The idea that a child might have emotional needs that should be considered alongside their educational requirements is simply not part of the conversation. Margaret needs to learn to be a lady, and the most efficient way to accomplish this is to place her in an environment where she will be surrounded by examples of proper feminine behaviour and removed from any influences that might interfere with this process. You represent one of those potentially interfering influences. As her brother, you're encouraged to be boisterous, to engage in physical activities, to develop the kind of confident assertiveness that will serve you well as a man. Margaret, in your company, might be tempted to join in games that are unsuitable for a future lady, might develop habits of speech or behaviour that would need to be corrected later. The carriage driver loads Margaret's trunk with practiced efficiency, as if he's transported countless children to new lives and has learned not to think too deeply about the human cost of these transactions. The trunk is strapped securely to the back of the carriage, and Margaret is helped inside with the kind of formal courtesy typically reserved for adults. Through the carriage window, she looks impossibly small. The interior is designed for grown-ups, with seats that are too high for her feet to touch the floor, and cushions that seem to swallow her slight frame. She waves at you with determined cheerfulness, the way children do when they're trying to convince the adults that they're brave enough for whatever's being asked of them. Your parents watch the carriage disappear down the lane with the satisfied expression of people who have handled a difficult but necessary task successfully. Your father claps you on the shoulder and mentions something about beginning your proper education, now that you won't be distracted by childish games. Your mother returns to the house and begins reorganizing the room you shared with Margaret, removing her belongings and converting it into a proper young gentleman's quarters. The speed with which Margaret's presence is erased from the household is remarkable. By evening, it's as if she never existed. Her side of the bed has been stripped and the mattress turned. Her clothes have been removed from the chest you shared. The small collection of treasures she kept in a wooden box under the window. Interesting stones, dried flowers, a bird's nest found intact after a storm has been cleared away and presumably discarded. You're moved into what was previously a storage room, given your own bed, your own space, your own possessions, arranged with the kind of order that suggests permanence. The adults speak of this as a privilege, a sign that you're growing up, but mostly it feels like sleeping in a tomb. The silence is profound in a way that makes you acutely aware of how much of your life was shaped by Margaret's quiet breathing, her occasional murmurs in her sleep, the rustle of bedclothes when she turned over. Your education begins immediately, and with a seriousness that suggests there's no time to waste on sentiment. A tutor is engaged, a stern man with strong opinions about Latin grammar and the mathematical principles necessary for managing agricultural accounts. He arrives each morning at precisely 8 o'clock and subjects you to 4 hours of intensive instruction that leaves your head spinning and your hand cramped from copying exercises. The tutor, Mr. Whitmore, has been educating the sons of gentlemen for over 20 years, and he has definite ideas about how boys should be shaped into men. Physical comfort is viewed with suspicion as something that might breed weakness. Emotional expression is discouraged as unmanly. The focus is entirely on filling your mind with the knowledge and skills you'll need to take your place in adult society. Latin is considered essential, not because you'll ever need to conduct conversations in a dead language, but because it demonstrates education and refinement. A gentleman who can quote Virgil or construct a proper Latin sentence is marking himself as someone who has received the kind of education that separates the truly civilized from the merely prosperous. Mathematics is equally important, though for more practical reasons. You'll need to understand accounts, calculate interest on loans, determine the yield from various agricultural enterprises, and handle the financial complexities of managing property and investments. Whitmore approaches mathematical instruction with the fervour of a military commander, as if your ability to properly calculate compound interest might determine the fate of nations. The isolation of your new educational arrangement is profound. Where you once spent your days in Margaret's company, exploring the grounds together, inventing games, and sharing the small adventures that fill childhood, you now spend them in the company of a middle-aged man who views childhood as a temporary inconvenience to be overcome as quickly as possible. Margaret's letters begin arriving after she's been gone for a month, carefully composed documents that bear clear evidence of adult supervision. Her handwriting, never particularly neat, has been transformed into the kind of careful script that suggests hours of practice under critical observation. The content is similarly artificial mise, polite inquiries about your health, descriptions of her studies that sound like recitations from a textbook, expressions of gratitude for the opportunity to receive such excellent instruction. Reading these letters is like communicating with a stranger who happens to share Margaret's name, the sister who used to whisper jokes to you after the adults thought you were asleep, who would sneak extra food from dinner to share later, who knew exactly how to make you laugh when you were feeling miserable. That person has been replaced by a polite young lady who writes stilted sentences about the improvement in her French pronunciation and her progress with needlework. Your own letters to Margaret are similarly edited. Your mother reviews everything you write, making corrections not just to grammar and spelling, but to content that she deems inappropriate. Complaints about Mr. Whitmore's harsh teaching methods are deleted. References to missing her company are softened into more acceptable expressions of brotherly regard. Descriptions of your daily activities are edited to emphasize educational progress rather than personal feelings. The result is a correspondence that maintains the appearance of sibling connection while systematically destroying its substance. You're exchanging letters with someone who was once your closest companion, but the letters themselves are preventing any real communication. The adults who facilitate this correspondence are pleased with its propriety, apparently unaware that they're supervising the slow death of a relationship that once defined both your lives. The seasonal rhythms of your childhood, once shared with Margaret, become solitary experiences that feel diminished by her absence. The first snowfall, which you would once have celebrated together by building elaborate snow fortresses and engaging in carefully orchestrated battles, passes with only Mr. Whitmore's observation that winter weather provides excellent opportunities for indoor study. Spring arrives with the kind of beauty that makes you acutely aware of how much more enjoyable it would be with company. The woods behind the house, where you and Margaret once spent hours exploring and collecting specimens for imaginary scientific expeditions, remain unexplored. Your parents discourage such activities as wasteful of time that could be better spent on educational pursuits. The concept of childhood friendship, of relationships based on shared interests and mutual affection rather than social utility, is simply not part of the adult vocabulary in 1750. Your parents genuinely believe they're acting in your best interests by eliminating distractions and focusing your attention on the serious business of preparation for adult life. The other children in your social circle are experiencing similar separations, though the patterns vary depending on family circumstances and educational philosophy. Some families send their sons away to school while keeping daughters at home under the supervision of governesses. Others, like yours, distribute their children among various relatives who can provide specialized instruction. The result is a generation of children who grow up knowing their siblings primarily through formal correspondence and brief supervised visits during holidays. The easy intimacy of shared childhood experiences is systematically destroyed in favor of relationships based on proper social forms and family duty. Margaret's first visit home comes after she's been away for 8 months, and the change in her is remarkable and heartbreaking. She's grown, of course, but the physical changes are less significant than the transformation in her behavior. She moves with careful precision, speaks in the modulated tones of a young lady receiving visitors, and responds to your attempts at playful conversation with polite incomprehension. The sister who once knew exactly how to make you laugh, who could communicate entire conversations through exchanged glances, who shared your private jokes and understood your moods without explanation, that person has been replaced by a pleasant stranger who treats you with the courteous distance appropriate between a young lady and a gentleman of her acquaintance. Your parents are delighted with Margaret's progress. They praise her improved posture, her refined speech, her evident mastery of feminine accomplishments. She demonstrates her harpsichord skills with competent precision, displays needlework of impressive complexity, and converses in French with your aunt's governess during her brief visit. What they don't seem to notice, or perhaps choose not to notice, is the complete absence of spontaneity in her behaviour. Margaret has learned to be a proper young lady by suppressing everything that once made her distinctively herself. Her laughter, when it comes at all, is carefully modulated. Her opinions, when expressed, echo the conventional wisdom she's been taught, rather than reflecting any personal thoughts or feelings. The visit lasts only a week, and much of it is occupied with formal activities designed to display Margaret's educational progress. There are few opportunities for the kind of casual interaction that might allow you to reconnect with your sister. and when such opportunities do arise, Margaret seems genuinely uncomfortable with anything that resembles the easy familiarity you once shared. When the carriage arrives to take her back to your aunt's house, Margaret's departure is accomplished with the same polite efficiency that characterizes everything else about her transformed personality. She thanks your parents for their hospitality, expresses appropriate gratitude for the educational opportunities they've provided, and bids you farewell with the kind of formal courtesy she might show to any family acquaintance. Watching the carriage disappear down the lane for the second time, you're struck by the realization that you're not just losing Margaret's physical presence, you're losing her entirely. The person who returns for these brief visits shares her name and her face, but the essential Margaret, the sister who was once your closest companion and dearest friend, has been systematically eliminated in favor of someone who meets adult expectations of proper feminine behavior. Your own transformation is proceeding along parallel lines, though you're less aware of it from the inside. Mr. Whitmore's relentless instruction is having its intended effect. You're developing the knowledge and skills considered essential for a gentleman, but you're also learning to suppress the emotional expressiveness and natural curiosity that once defined your personality. The adults around you praise your progress with the same satisfaction they express about Margaret's transformation. You're becoming more serious, more focused, more capable of the kind of sustained attention that academic achievement requires. What they don't acknowledge is that this progress comes at the cost of everything that once made childhood enjoyable. The games you once played with Margaret seem childish and pointless now. The imaginative adventures you shared have been replaced by educational activities that serve clear, adult-approved purposes. The easy affection you once expressed toward your sister has been refined into the kind of proper familial regard that maintains appropriate emotional distance. By the time you're 10 and Margaret is 11, the transformation is complete. You've become a young gentleman with excellent prospects for further education and eventual social advancement. Margaret has become a young lady whose accomplishments will make her attractive to suitable marriage prospects when the time comes. The cost of these achievements is the complete destruction of the sibling relationship that once anchored both your childhoods. You maintain a formal correspondence, exchange appropriate gifts on birthdays and holidays, and treat each other with polite consideration during brief family gatherings. But the intimacy, the shared history, the deep emotional connection that once existed between you has been systematically eliminated in favor of relationships that serve adult social and economic purposes. The adults who orchestrated this transformation consider it a complete success. They've taken 2 children and shaped them into proper representatives of their social class, equipped with the knowledge and skills necessary for adult success. The fact that this process required the destruction of their emotional bond with each other is viewed as an unfortunate but necessary cost, the way a military commander might regret casualties while celebrating victory. Looking back from the perspective of adult life, you'll recognize that the separation from Margaret was part of a larger social system designed to maintain class distinctions and gender roles through rigid control of childhood experiences. Children who might naturally develop egalitarian relationships with their siblings are systematically separated and trained for their distinct adult roles, ensuring that social hierarchies are reproduced in each generation. But at 10 years old, standing in the lane, watching yet another carriage carry Margaret away from your life, you don't understand any of this. You only know that the person who once shared your days, your thoughts, your small adventures, and secret jokes has been transformed into a polite stranger who treats you with the courteous distance of someone fulfilling a social obligation. The loneliness of this realization is profound and lasting. You're learning, along with the Latin and mathematics, that will serve you well in adult life. that emotional connections are luxuries that proper people can't afford. The lesson will shape not just your relationship with Margaret, but your approach to all future relationships, creating patterns of emotional distance that will persist long after the educational purposes they served have been forgotten. You're standing in the Abbey courtyard at what you think might be midday, but you're not entirely sure because time itself seems to have its own peculiar agenda in this medieval world, and that agenda has absolutely nothing to do with the mechanical precision you might expect from something as fundamental as knowing when things happen. The bells have just finished ringing for sext, which means it's the 6th hour, but whether that corresponds to what you might call noon depends on a bewildering array of factors that seem designed by someone who thought timekeeping was getting far too straightforward. The problem begins with the basic medieval understanding of what constitutes an hour, which bears only a passing resemblance to the 60-minute intervals you might expect. Hours in the 14th century are not fixed units of time, but rather flexible concepts that expand and contract with the seasons, like some kind of temporal accordion played by a drunk musician. A summer hour can be nearly twice as long as a winter hour, and both are considered perfectly valid measurements of the same thing. The logic, such as it is, stems from the Roman tradition of dividing daylight into 12 equal parts, regardless of how much actual daylight is available. This means that in June, when the sun rises at 4 in the morning and sets at 8 in the evening, each daylight hour lasts 80 minutes by modern reckoning. In December, when daylight limps from 7 to 4, each hour clocks in at a mere 40 minutes. The result is a system where the length of time varies dramatically, depending on when you're trying to measure it, creating a world where saying "I'll meet you in 2 hours" is about as precise as saying "I'll meet you when the stars align favorably." But it gets stranger, and in ways that would make a modern project manager weep into his carefully scheduled coffee break. The medieval day doesn't even begin when you might expect it to. Depending on who you ask and what tradition they follow, the day might start at sunset, at midnight, at dawn, or at the moment when you can distinguish a white thread from a black one without artificial light. Different communities, sometimes living within sight of each other, operate on entirely different temporal systems, creating a landscape where crossing from one village to another might involve travelling through time as well as space. The monks who ring the bells that govern your daily schedule operate on what's called the canonical hours, a system that divides the day into 8 periods of prayer. These hours have names like lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline, which sound poetic until you realize you're supposed to use them to figure out when to show up for work, eat meals, or meet someone at the market. It's like using poetry to navigate, which might be spiritually uplifting, but is practically useless when you're trying to coordinate anything more complex than a solitary walk. The canonical hours are based on a combination of Roman timekeeping, biblical references, and monastic tradition that creates a system so complex it would challenge a modern computer programmer with a degree in both theology and astronomy. Prime is supposed to occur at the first hour of daylight, but the definition of first hour varies depending on the season, the local interpretation of canonical law, the particular saint's day being observed, and what appears to be the personal mood of whoever decided to become an expert in these matters. Terce follows at the 3rd hour, sext at the 6th, and none at the 9th. But these numbers refer to the Roman system of counting from sunrise, not to any absolute time that would make sense to someone from a more chronologically organized century. This means that sext, theoretically, the 6th hour and thus midday, might occur anywhere from what you'd call 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., depending on the season, the enthusiasm of whoever's in charge of bell ringing, and the local community's collective relationship with punctuality. The bell ringer himself, is a source of additional temporal confusion that adds personal eccentricity to an already chaotic system. Brother Thomas has been calling the hours for 15 years, and he's developed his own interpretations of when exactly each canonical hour should be observed. He takes into account not just the position of the sun, but also the weather, the liturgical calendar, his assessment of how much work needs to be done before the next meal, the behaviour of the abbey's livestock, and what appears to be a personal vendetta against anything resembling predictable scheduling. Brother Thomas consults a bewildering array of tools to determine the proper time for each bell, and each tool provides information that contradicts all the others with remarkable consistency. There's a sundial in the cloister, carefully carved from local stone by a craftsman who clearly understood the principles of solar movement, but may have been unclear on the concept of accuracy. The sundial is only useful when the sun is shining, which in this part of England means it's decorative roughly half the year and completely useless during the other half. There's also a water clock that measures time by the steady drip of water through a carefully calibrated opening, but the calibration seems to have been done by someone with a very loose interpretation of the word steady. The water clock is supposed to provide consistent timekeeping regardless of weather conditions, but in practice it's influenced by temperature, humidity, the quality of the water being used, and what Brother Thomas swears is the phase of the moon, though you suspect the phase of his digestion might be more relevant. The water clock is a marvel of medieval engineering and a constant source of frustration for anyone trying to use it for anything resembling precision. The mechanism involves a series of containers, tubes and measuring devices that work together to create a timepiece that's both ingenious and completely unreliable. The rate of water flow varies with temperature, slower when it's cold, faster when it's warm, which means the clock runs differently in different seasons and even at different times of day. When the water freezes in winter, which happens with depressing regularity in the unheated bell tower, time effectively stops until someone remembers to light a fire under the mechanism. This creates periods when the abbey operates in a kind of temporal vacuum, with no reliable way to mark the canonical hours, except for Brother Thomas's increasingly creative interpretations of solar position and divine inspiration. There's also an hourglass, several candle clocks, and what Brother Thomas refers to as his intuitive sense of temporal flow, which seems to be influenced by factors ranging from his digestion to the behaviour of the abbey's cats. The hourglass is reasonably accurate as long as the sand doesn't get damp, which it does constantly in the English climate, causing it to clump and flow irregularly. The candle clocks burn at different rates depending on the quality of the wax, the humidity of the air, and whether there's a draft in the tower, which there always is. The result is a system where the canonical hours might be called early, late, or occasionally skipped entirely, if Brother Thomas is having what he diplomatically calls a challenging day. These challenging days seem to coincide with feast days, market days, and any day when the weather is particularly unpleasant, suggesting that Brother Thomas's temporal intuition is more influenced by convenience than by divine revelation. The confusion extends beyond the abbey walls into the broader community, where different groups operate on different temporal systems with the cheerful incompatibility of people who've never considered that coordination might be useful. The farmers follow the sun and the seasons, rising at dawn and working until dusk, regardless of what any bell ringer might think about canonical hours. Their schedule is dictated by the practical requirements of agricultural work. Cows need to be milked when they need to be milked, not when some monk decides it's the appropriate canonical moment. The merchants in the market town operate on what might charitably be called commercial time, where meetings happen when the business is ready and transactions occur at the appropriate moment. This creates a marketplace where you might arrange to meet someone at the third hour, only to discover that your third hour and their third hour have about as much in common as a fish and a bicycle. The merchant's third hour depends on when he opened his stall, how much business he's done, whether any interesting travellers have arrived with goods to trade, and his personal assessment of when the market crowd reaches optimal density for profitable commerce. The craftsmen have their own system based on the practical requirements of their work, which creates pockets of temporal independence throughout the community. A blacksmith can't stop hammering heated iron just because a bell is ringing. The iron doesn't care about canonical hours, and waiting for the next appropriate moment might mean ruining an entire day's work. A baker can't leave bread in the oven because some monk has decided it's time for prayer. Bread operates on its own schedule, and that schedule is dictated by chemistry rather than theology. This creates a fascinating network of specialized time systems, each perfectly logical within its own context, but completely incompatible with all the others. The potter's time is governed by the drying rate of clay and the heating cycle of his kiln. The weaver's time depends on the availability of light for detailed work and the completion of complex patterns that can't be interrupted. The carpenter's time is dictated by weather conditions that affect the behavior of wood and the drying of various adhesives and finishes. The nobility, when they're not off fighting wars or attending court, operate on what can only be described as aristocratic time, where punctuality is considered a virtue for servants, but a sign of insufficient importance for anyone with real social standing. A nobleman who arrives precisely on time for an appointment is suggesting that he has nothing better to do, which is socially unacceptable in a culture where status is partly determined by how many people are waiting for you. This aristocratic approach to time creates its own set of complications when nobles need to interact with anyone operating on a more practical schedule. A lord who summons a craftsman for the third hour might actually expect the craftsman to wait around until the lord feels ready to see him, which could be anywhere from the second hour to the fifth, depending on the lord's other activities, his mood, and his assessment of how long the craftsman should wait to properly demonstrate respect. The result is a complex dance of temporal negotiation, where everyone involved understands that stated times are approximate at best, and that actual scheduling depends on an intricate web of social, practical, and personal factors that have little to do with any formal timekeeping system. A meeting arranged for after prime might actually occur at any point between what we'd call 7 a.m. and 10 a.m., depending on which prime is being referenced, who's doing the referencing, and what other activities need to be completed first. This creates layers of temporal confusion that would challenge a philosopher and frequently do challenge the merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who need to coordinate their activities across these different time systems. You might arrange to meet a merchant after terce only to discover that he follows a different calendar that places terce an hour earlier than your abbey's bells. The merchant might agree to meet at the market opening, but market opening depends on when enough vendors have arrived to constitute a market, which varies based on weather, road conditions, the local Saints' Day observances, and collective mood. The seasonal variation in hour length creates additional complications that most people handle by simply ignoring them, which works surprisingly well until someone tries to plan something that crosses seasonal boundaries. A summer working day that lasts 12 hours might actually consume 16 hours of consistent time, while a winter working day of the same nominal length might be over in 8 hours. Workers are paid by the day rather than by the hour, which means summer employment is significantly more demanding than winter employment, though everyone pretends not to notice this mathematical reality. The church calendar adds another layer of temporal complexity that intersects with the daily confusion in ways that seem designed to test human patience and possibly divine sense of humour. Different saints' days require different observances that affect the timing of canonical hours, the scheduling of meals, and the organisation of work. Some saints' days move around the calendar based on lunar calculations that date back to early Christian attempts to reconcile Jewish, Roman, and Germanic calendar systems, creating a scheduling nightmare that makes modern daylight saving time look like a model of clarity. Easter, the most important celebration in the Christian calendar, moves around based on a calculation so complex that special committees of learned clerks spend months determining when it should fall. The calculation involves determining the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. But the vernal equinox used for this calculation is not the actual astronomical equinox, but a fixed date established by church authority. And the full moon is not the actual full moon, but a theoretical full moon calculated according to mathematical tables that may or may not correspond to what's actually happening in the sky. The date of Easter affects not just Easter itself, but the timing of Lent, Pentecost, and dozens of other observances that ripple through the entire year, creating a calendar that shifts and changes like a living thing. This means that the second Sunday after Pentecost might fall on completely different dates in consecutive years, and planning anything for a specific date requires checking not just the day of the week, but also the liturgical calendar, the local Saints' Day observances, and the phase of whatever ecclesiastical cycle happens to be operating at the time. The result is a world where next Thursday might mean something completely different, depending on whether Thursday falls during Lent, coincides with a Saint's Day, happens during one of the seasonal periods when the church calendar follows different rules, or occurs during one of the periodic calendar adjustments that church authorities make to keep their theoretical system aligned with astronomical reality. Planning anything more than a few days in advance requires the kind of theological and astronomical knowledge that most people simply don't possess, plus a willingness to remain flexible when the plan inevitably runs into temporal complications. Even the concept of the week is more flexible than you might expect, operating as a general guideline rather than a rigid structure. While 7-day weeks are generally observed, the names and significance of individual days vary depending on local traditions, church practices, and regional customs that reflect the complex layering of cultural influences that created medieval society. Market days, court days, and religious observances create a pattern of activity that might make Wednesday feel like the most important day of the week in one town, while Tuesday dominates the rhythm of life in the next village. The measurement of longer periods, months, seasons, years, operates on similar principles of flexible interpretation that prioritize practical utility over abstract precision. The agricultural calendar, based on planting and harvest, might consider spring to begin when the ground can be worked, regardless of what any formal calendar might say about equinoxes or zodiacal transitions. The ecclesiastical calendar follows its own logic based on religious observances that sometimes align with natural seasons and sometimes don't, creating periods when the church calendar and the agricultural calendar are operating in completely different seasonal frameworks. Years themselves are counted differently, depending on who's doing the counting and for what purpose, creating a system where the same event might be dated several different ways in different documents. The church might date events from the Incarnation, while legal documents might use the regnal year of the current king. Local communities might count from the founding of their town, the building of their church, or some memorable event like a particularly devastating fire, flood, or military campaign that serves as a temporal landmark for the community. This creates historical records that read like puzzles designed by someone with a perverse sense of humor and a deep commitment to making life difficult for future historians. An event might be recorded as occurring in the 15th year of King Edward's reign on the feast of St. Michael, during the third week of harvest, when the moon was waxing and the abbey bells had been ringing none for 2 days due to Brother Thomas's illness, leaving future researchers to figure out what any of that means in terms of an absolute date. The practical effect of all this temporal confusion is that medieval life operates on what might be called approximate time, where precision is less important than general coordination and mutual understanding. People arrange to meet around midday or after the morning work is done, or when the market is busy, using descriptions that communicate intent and context, rather than specific moments that can be measured by any mechanical device. This system actually works remarkably well for a society where most activities are governed by natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules imposed by mechanical timekeeping. Farmers don't need to know the exact time to determine when to milk cows. The cows provide their own scheduling through the straightforward mechanism of bovine discomfort. Craftsmen don't need precise timing to know when to break for meals. Hunger is a perfectly adequate timekeeper, and one that's much more reliable than any water clock or candle timepiece. The problems arise when different temporal systems need to interact, which happens with increasing frequency as trade, travel, and communication become more complex and far-reaching. A merchant traveling from one town to another might find that his careful scheduling becomes meaningless as he moves between communities operating on different time systems, each perfectly logical within its own context, but incompatible with all the others. The solution, such as it is, involves a kind of temporal flexibility that modern people would find maddening, but which medieval people accept as a natural part of life's complexity. Appointments are made with generous margins for error that account for the various ways time might be interpreted. Important events are scheduled around multiple time markers to ensure that people operating on different systems can still coordinate. Messages include elaborate descriptions of timing that account for seasonal variation, local custom, and the personal eccentricities of whoever happens to be in charge of timekeeping in any particular location. The art of temporal communication becomes a crucial skill in this environment, requiring a deep understanding of how different communities interpret time and an ability to translate between different temporal systems. A successful merchant learns to speak fluent farmer time, monastery time, market time, and noble time, adjusting his scheduling expectations and communication style to match the temporal culture of whoever he's dealing with. Brother Thomas, returning to his bell tower after the midday meal that occurred at what might charitably be called noon, prepares to ring the bell for none the 9th hour. He consults his sundial, which shows one position, his water clock, which suggests another, his hourglass, which provides a third opinion, and his internal sense of appropriate timing, which operates on principles known only to himself and possibly God, though God's involvement in Brother Thomas's timekeeping decisions remains a matter of theological speculation. The process of determining when to ring none involves a complex calculation that takes into account the readings from all his various timepieces, the weather conditions, the liturgical requirements of the day, the practical needs of the community, and what Brother Thomas refers to as the proper flow of temporal energy, which might be mystical insight or might be his way of describing the accumulated effects of 15 years of making these decisions without any real guidance from church authorities. The bell rings across the countryside, its sound carrying for miles and providing a temporal anchor for the communities within its reach. Some people will respond immediately, dropping whatever they're doing to observe the canonical hour. Others will finish their current tasks before acknowledging the bell's call. Still others will interpret the bell as a general suggestion rather than a specific instruction, understanding that Brother Thomas's timing is approximate at best, and that the real purpose of the bell is to provide a rough framework for coordinating community activities rather than precise scheduling. This flexibility might seem chaotic to someone accustomed to mechanical precision, but it allows a complex society to function without the rigid coordination that mechanical timekeeping would eventually make possible. The medieval approach to time prioritizes human needs and natural rhythms over abstract accuracy, creating a temporal environment that's organic, adaptable, and deeply frustrating to anyone expecting clockwork precision. In the Abbey scriptorium, Brother Benedict carefully notes the time of none in his chronicle, recording it as the 9th hour of the day, when the sun had passed its zenith, and the shadows began to lengthen toward evening, at the time when Brother Thomas rang the bell according to his usual custom and the will of divine providence. Future readers will have to interpret this description based on their own understanding of seasonal variation, local custom, and Brother Thomas's personal approach to timekeeping, continuing the medieval tradition of temporal approximation that makes every historical date a puzzle waiting to be solved by scholars with more patience than precision. The strange logic of medieval timekeeping reflects a world where human activities are integrated with natural rhythms rather than imposed upon them by mechanical systems that prioritize abstract accuracy over practical utility. Time serves life rather than dominating it, creating a temporal landscape that is organic, flexible, and deeply frustrating to anyone expecting the mechanical precision that later centuries would take for granted. In this world, being on time is less important than being in harmony with the complex web of natural, social, and spiritual forces that govern daily existence, creating a approach to temporality that's both more humane and more complicated than anything a modern clock could provide.